On a spring evening when Paris wore its old, patient light like a shawl, the Louvre looked as it had for decades, a slow, deliberate presence on the Seine, its classical facades softened by evening shadows. The glass pyramid a bright, precise punctuation against the sky. To thousands it was simply a place of pilgrimage, families murmuring over favorites, students sketching in the corners. Lovers pausing under paintings that had grown larger than the lives that loved them. Yet museums are more than stewards of things, they are keepers of memory. Of centuries stacked together in gilded frames and cool stone. On the night the museum slept, those memories curled inward like pages waiting to be turned. The building's heartbeat had always been a mixture of art and human routine. Conservators in linen smocks padded through galleries to check humidity and light, their hands practiced at reading the small ailments of canvas and wood. Curators bent over accession books that recorded the lineage of objects as carefully as family trees, their handwriting traced the passage of provenance and care. Security teams, an invisible net ordinarily taken for granted, walked measured circuits through marble corridors, keys in hand and eyes trained for anomalies. The janitors, with their late-night brooms and soft jokes, were as much a part of the place's lore as the masterpieces themselves. In that sense, the Louvre was never truly empty. It slept with a million small guardians in its bones. That night, however, had the hush of something different, a thickness in the air as if the city itself held its breath. The galleries were closed to visitors, only a sparse staff tended the building's needs. A retrospective installation would open in 2 days, an exhibition that gathered improbable companions across periods and styles, and panels needed last-minute light adjustments. The head curator, Elise, walked through with soft steps, pausing now and then to study a face in a painting as if listening for a whisper. Elise had worked at the museum for 20 years. She knew each room like a spine knows its vertebrae. Her life had been a series of small, faithful attentions, a cleaning schedule, a conservation budget fought for and won, a bout of winter when a broken pipe almost took a fresco. She loved the work because it involved tending other people's stories. That devotion made the things in the museum more than objects, they were living histories she had the privilege to steward. In a security office above the wing, Laurent, a veteran guard with fatigue written in the lines at the corner of his eyes, monitored the usual glow of camera feeds. His uniform was quiet, his manner quieter. He had once been an art history student before circumstances led him into the night work that kept the museum safe after hours. Laurent liked to imagine the camera feeds as a chessboard. Pieces moved across black squares, lights refreshing every few seconds, and his job was to notice when a piece behaved oddly. On that broadcast of feeds he watched his colleagues. Faces on the patrol screens, small vignettes of human presence, and then he checked the log, made his notes, and took an extra moment to brew coffee he didn't really have time for. Habit, for him, was a kind of prayer. Far below in a closed gallery, a painting, not the largest, not the most famous, waited on the wall. It had been moved recently from its usual room to accommodate the new installation. The painting had a modest fame, admired by scholars, loved quietly by a generation of art students, often mentioned in footnotes rather than front pages. Its frame held the kind of patina that suggested both age and patience, wood softened by time, gilding that had lost its first burnish but kept its dignity. When people spoke of the night later, many would be surprised it was this painting chosen among so many treasures. Yet even masterpieces have their own quiet gravity. Sometimes what is taken matters not because of name alone, but because of the small ways it knits into human lives. Outside, Paris slept and the Seine moved like a black ribbon beneath the bridges, reflecting the city's lamps with the same steady, distant rhythm. A tram passed, a couple on a bench exchanged a laugh. And a dog barked twice in the far distance. The city's pulse was ordinary and breathtaking, made of small, repeated human gestures that make life possible. Inside the museum, the hush deepened. People left their coats in a cloakroom and said goodnights to colleagues with the same casual tenderness that bolsters community life everywhere. The night staff split into small groups, a conservator checked the climate controls, a technician adjusted the gallery lights. The museum, in all its weight and wonder, settled down. It is strange how rearrangements of everyday things can feel like rearrangements of destiny. A conservator's note written in pencil, a crate moved an inch to the left, A security shift scheduled a half-hour earlier, such small faults and acts of care ripple outward in time. They create possibilities where none were planned. On that night, an administrative decision meant that the painting would be stored, not on the usual rack, but temporarily placed in a climate-controlled alcove with less direct sightline from the main cameras. The reason was practical and banal: renovation scaffolding obstructed the regular route, and the staff believed the alcove would be safer from incidental bumps. The change made sense on paper. The story of a theft rarely begins with malice, often it starts with opportunity, the same way a flood begins with a slowly rising tide. That evening, a late maintenance request had called 2 technicians to a different wing. A delivery truck idled outside longer than usual, waiting to be unloaded. In the quiet between routines, someone new walked through a corridor, not a visitor, and not wholly recognized by the night staff, someone with a measured gait, hands in their pockets, eyes curious and careful. They carried no visible tools, only a small satchel, and they seemed to belong to the night as if night itself had made them. These are the moments where fiction and real life conspire, people moving like shadows across a stage, intent unclear, faces anonymous. When an alarm finally sounded, not the shrill red one of immediate breach but the softer alert for motion after hours, Laurent's chest did not jump so much as tighten. He rubbed his temple and switched cameras, watching pixels resolve into shapes. The feed was grainy, the figures outline a sketch against the dim gallery lights. His radio crackled, he called for a routine check. Protocol exists for steadiness, and he moved through it with practiced hands. But even protocols are human stories written on paper, and human stories are subject to delay and doubt. The path to the painting was not direct, it bent through open space and shadows and the scaffolding of art in progress. That path, that soft, unremarkable corridor, would later be remembered as the night's hinge. In the hours that followed, the museum's silence unrolled into a narrative that would not soon be quieted. By dawn, the painting, the quiet star of that section, was gone from its frame. A conservator in a cardigan, who had come early to measure light, found instead an empty space where varnish and canvas used to breathe. The shock moved through the building like cold wind. Elise walked the galleries again, this time with the particular horror of one who watches stewardship become betrayal. Her hands shook when she signed the incident report. Her voice, usually a calm instrument for lectures and interviews, held a crack that even strangers could hear. Laurent sat in the security office and felt the old narratives of art loss recite themselves in his mind: headlines, investigations, the slow meticulous work of recovery that might or might not end in justice. Word spread in the city as dawn broke: something had been taken from the Louvre. At first, the tone was disbelief, then sorrow, then a peculiar kind of communal grief. A museum is a public trust, and when the trust is violated it feels like a theft of memory itself. People who had never stepped inside the grand halls felt the loss as if a shared organ of cultural life had been bruised. Journalists arrived with cameras and polite, urgent questions. Specialists were called in to verify every detail. The police cordoned off entrances, and the museum's director requested patience while a precise inventory was taken. In that moment, the Louvre, always a monument to human creativity, became the site of a contemporary drama that would stitch together questions about value, vulnerability, and what it means to protect the past. If art is the memory of civilization, then its absence is an ache that pulls at more than collectors and curators. The missing painting would be spoken of in cafes, in classrooms, in government halls. Debates would arise about security budgets and cultural priorities. Occasional conspiracy theories would splice themselves into public conversation like errant vines. But the most immediate responses were human: colleagues consoling each other, volunteers calling, the museum's phone ringing with offers of help and with notes from strangers who recalled the painting's warm colors and small, telling brushstrokes. People wanted to be part of the recovery, not merely of an object but of the spirit that object embodied. And so, the night that the museum slept became the first line in a longer story about guardianship, loss, and the stubborn tenderness that arises when something lovely is taken. The first chapter of any such event is always a horizon rather than an end. It contains the hush before the storm's public pages fill with names and charges and the long, patient work of legal process. It contains the traces of human choices and small attentions that could have been different. It is made of ordinary gestures that become weighty in hindsight. In the Louvre's hush that night, the city turned another page in a story that is both ancient and immediate, the story of how a society remembers, how it protects, and how it responds when those protections fail. The night the museum slept was also the night people around the world woke up to the idea that even treasures bound to collective memory are fragile, and that their fragility calls for care not only from guards and glass but from the public who claims them as common heritage. Morning in Paris has its own temperament, the kind of light that refuses haste, the rhythm of footsteps on cobblestones, and the first scent of coffee drifting from cafes that have survived revolutions, recessions, and romance. But that morning was not like any other. The usual hum of conversation around the Louvre was replaced by something taut, electric. The museum, usually a hive of art lovers and tourists, was now a fortress under quiet siege. Blue police tape lined the entrances, and every person who passed the courtyard of the glass pyramid seemed to pause, whisper, and glance at the building as if it could somehow confess its secrets. Inside, the air was heavy with a different kind of silence, not the reverent hush of a gallery, but the strained quiet of disbelief. Elise, the curator who had spent most of her life in the Louvre's care, stood in front of the empty frame, her arms folded not from cold but from a need to hold herself together. The frame, still hanging precisely where it had been, looked strangely dignified, a ghostly outline of loss. Dust motes drifted through the shaft of morning light that broke through the high windows, landing where once color and form had lived. "We frame absence," Elise murmured under her breath, her voice almost lost in the vastness of the gallery. Around her, investigators in dark suits and white gloves were cataloguing every inch of the scene, the angle of the frame, the texture of the wall, even the faint residue of where the painting's backboard had pressed against the mount. Captain Arnaud Delorme, a quiet, analytical man from the Paris police prefecture, was in charge of the investigation. He was not a man of flamboyant gestures or speeches. His authority came from a deliberate calm that could unnerve even the most confident suspects. Delorme believed in listening, to words, to silences, to the small hesitations people made when truth brushed against memory. He approached the frame as one might approach a patient in a hospital, careful, respectful, professional. "It's not the size," he said to Elise softly. "It's the precision. Whoever did this knew the building, or knew someone who did." Laurent, the night guard, stood nearby, his face pale with fatigue and shame. He had replayed the security footage countless times in the hours since the disappearance. The figure caught by the camera was ghost-like, grainy, featureless, moving with quiet confidence through the shadows. "They knew where to walk," Laurent said, rubbing his temples. "Not too close to the cameras, not too far from them either. Like they'd rehearsed it." His voice cracked slightly at the end. To him, this was not just a crime, it was a failure of guardianship, a betrayal of trust in his watch. In the security office, the investigators went through hours of footage frame by frame. Screens glowed with images of empty corridors, flickering shadows, and timestamp after timestamp that showed nothing unusual until the single moment when a shape entered the frame. The figure's build was average, the movements economical, almost graceful. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. There was no face visible, no sound beyond the low hum of the building. What caught Delorme's attention, however, was not what the figure did, it was what they didn't do. No rush, no fumbling. Just an almost reverent stillness before the painting, as if the person were taking a breath of art before removing it from the wall. This was not a smash and grab, Delorme concluded. This was personal. Paris is a city that has seen everything: revolutions, coronations, liberation, despair, yet it never loses its habit of asking questions. That morning, it seemed the whole city had become a detective. Cafes buzzed not with the usual talk of politics or love but with speculation about the stolen masterpiece. Every paper carried the same photograph of the empty frame, gilded and solemn, as if it were a portrait of absence itself. The radio hosts spoke in hushed, dramatic tones, and on every social feed, theories multiplied like reflections in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. But amid the noise, a few minds, sharp, patient, and grounded, were beginning to piece together something quieter, something that might actually resemble the truth. Captain Arnaud Delorme sat in his office surrounded by maps of the Louvre, blueprints of its service tunnels, and photographs of every staff member who had access to the galleries after hours. His notepad, filled with his meticulous handwriting, contained 2 pages titled Possible Motives. Under it, 4 words: money, message, memory, meaning. He had circled the last one. He couldn't explain why, but something in the act, the precision, the calmness of the intruder spoke not of greed but of purpose. Whoever had taken the painting had treated it almost tenderly. That ruled out the usual suspects: smugglers, black market dealers, or collectors with too much money and too little conscience. This was something else. At the same time, across the river in her small apartment in Montparnasse, Clara Moreau was bent over her laptop, her desk littered with coffee cups and scribbled notes. She had spent most of the night reading about the history of art thefts, from the Mona Lisa's infamous disappearance in 1911 to the Gardner Museum heist in Boston, and even the digital age crimes of stolen NFTs. But this one felt different. No ransom note, no signature. Just a void. A ghost took it, she whispered to herself, half in jest, half in awe. The more she read, the more she felt there was a story beneath the crime, a story about devotion, obsession, and the fragile human connection to beauty. Meanwhile, inside the Louvre, Elise and her team had begun cataloguing every detail of the missing artwork's life. It was not one of the museum's most famous pieces, not a Da Vinci or a Delacroix, but it held quiet significance. A late 18th century portrait by a relatively unknown artist, The Lady with the Golden Veil, had been admired for its softness and its mystery. The subject's face, half shadowed, half revealed, was said to be modeled after a noblewoman who vanished during the French Revolution. Some called it cursed, others called it forgotten, but Elise knew it as something else entirely: a survivor. She has lived through war, fire, and neglect, Elise told her assistant. She has waited centuries to be seen. Whoever took her, knew her. Delorme arrived at Elise's office later that day, his trench coat still damp from the drizzle outside. Madame Fournier, he greeted her, I need to know everything about this painting, every time it has moved, every person who has touched it, every key that has opened this gallery. Elise nodded, already anticipating his needs. It was restored in 2018, she said, opening a file. The restorer was a woman named Amira Dufresne. Brilliant, young, precise. She documented every brushstroke. Since then, the painting has not left this building except once. Delorme raised an eyebrow. Once? Yes, Elise replied, her voice softening. During the pandemic, we transferred several pieces to a secure storage facility outside Paris for humidity control. It stayed there for 6 months. Only 2 people handled the transport. Delorme wrote the names carefully, Vincent Artois and Lucien Dufresne. The second name caught his attention. Dufresne, he repeated. Any relation to the restorer? Elise hesitated. Her brother, she said. They both worked in conservation before he left the field, under complicated circumstances. She didn't elaborate, but Delorme caught the slight change in her tone, the one that meant pain. Find him, he said quietly to his assistant. Across town, Clara's phone buzzed. It was her editor. You're on the Louvre story full-time, he told her. We want something fresh. Not police statements, human perspective. Why do people risk everything for art? Clara smiled faintly. That was exactly the question she'd been chasing in her notes. She decided to visit the Louvre again, not as a reporter seeking quotes, but as someone trying to listen to the silence, the echoes, the unseen conversations between paintings and walls. She walked through the barricades with her press pass, notebook tucked under her arm, and stopped before the empty frame. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, under her breath, what do you want us to learn from this? That night, as Paris turned silver under the moon, Delorme's team traced the Dufresne siblings. Amira, the restorer, still lived in the Marais district, surrounded by canvases, pigments, and the faint smell of turpentine. Her brother Lucien, however, was harder to find. He had once been a prodigy, a conservation scientist obsessed with authenticity, color chemistry, and the spiritual essence of art. But after a controversy over forged provenance records, he had vanished from the museum world entirely. The trail led to a small art collective on the outskirts of the city, a group known for radical performance pieces that blurred the line between creation and theft. Delorme decided to visit Amira first. Her studio was a cathedral of light, its tall windows filled with the soft glow of dusk. She greeted him politely but with wariness, her fingers still stained with gold leaf. "You think Lucien took it," she said before he could even ask. Delorme's calm expression didn't change. "I think he understands whoever did," he replied. Amira sighed, setting down her brush. "My brother loved that painting," she admitted. "He said it was alive. He said you could feel its pulse under the varnish. But love makes people reckless, Captain. And Lucien has always believed that art should be free, that museums are cages for beauty." Delorme studied her face, the exhaustion, the hint of loyalty she couldn't quite hide. "If he took it," he said softly, "he didn't just break the law. He broke you." Amira looked away. "You don't understand," she murmured. "He thinks he's saving it." At the same moment, Clara was meeting with a retired security consultant named Henri Valois, who had once redesigned the Louvre surveillance system. Over coffee, she asked him what he thought. Henri chuckled darkly. "Everyone thinks stealing from the Louvre is impossible," he said. "But that's because they look at it as a building. The real weakness isn't the walls, it's the people. You'd be surprised how often art leaves museums with a key and a smile." Clara jotted down every word. Her instincts were sharpening. This wasn't about brute force, it was about belief, someone believing so deeply in what art means that they were willing to commit a crime to prove it. Back in his office, Delorme studied the new report. Forensic analysis had found a faint trace of varnish near the window ledge identical to the compound used by Lucien Dufresne in his past restoration work. It was enough to connect him to the scene, but not enough for a warrant. Still, Delorme knew he was close. The thief wasn't just any intruder. They were someone who knew how the museum breathed. As the city settled into the midnight hush, Clara sat by her window, writing her first line for the article that would change everything. Theft is not always about taking, sometimes, it's about reminding the world what it has forgotten. And somewhere in the shadows of Paris, in a quiet studio lit by a single lamp, Lucien Dufresne gazed at the painting, the lady with the golden veil resting safely against a wall. "You're home now," he whispered. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame tolled softly across the river, and the city kept asking its eternal question, what is beauty worth? Lucien Dufresne had not always been a thief. Once, he had been a believer, a scientist of light, a restorer who treated paint and canvas like sacred relics. Those who knew him in his early years remembered the quiet passion in his eyes whenever he spoke of color. He used to say that every pigment was a voice, and that to restore a painting was to listen to a conversation that had been waiting for centuries. But the world had changed, and somewhere along the line, the music had stopped. Museums became fortresses. Art became currency. Beauty became product. Lucien watched as collectors bid millions not for what they loved, but for what they could own. It broke something inside him, slowly, invisibly, like a hairline crack beneath varnish. Now, standing in his dimly lit studio, the stolen painting before him, Lucien studied the lady with the golden veil with reverence. Dust motes floated in the air, golden in the lamplight. The woman in the portrait looked almost alive, her half-shadowed eyes soft, secretive, timeless. Lucien reached out and traced the edge of the frame with trembling fingers. "You were never meant to be behind glass," he murmured. "You were meant to be seen by souls, not tourists." It wasn't greed that had driven him to take her. It was grief for the world's loss of wonder. The plan had come to him months before the heist. It had started as an idea, almost philosophical, what if beauty could be rescued from captivity? He had imagined it as a gesture, a statement, an art piece in itself. He called it the Liberation Project. The goal was not to sell, not to destroy, but to remind. He would take one painting, not the most famous, not the most expensive, but one that symbolized quiet humanity. He would care for it, document it, and one day reveal it to the world again, free, anonymous, unowned. The act would force the world to question what it meant to possess art. He wanted people to feel what he felt when he first touched a centuries-old canvas: awe, humility, connection. But as the days passed, the simplicity of that dream began to unravel beneath the weight of reality. The theft had gone perfectly, too perfectly, and now the world was in uproar. The media turned the act into spectacle. The Louvre's walls hummed with suspicion and fear. And Lucien, the ghost behind the frame, realized that his idea of liberation had become an act of war in the eyes of the world. Still, he told himself, revolutions were never tidy. He kept a notebook filled with sketches, reflections, and fragments of philosophy. One page, torn and smudged, read, "We preserve art, but we forget to preserve the feeling it once gave us. We clean its surface, but not our own hearts." Those words haunted him. They were both his excuse and his punishment. Every night he wrote more about the difference between protection and imprisonment, about how art had become like an animal in a zoo, admired, but not alive. In his mind, the Louvre was not a sanctuary but a mausoleum, and he, its grave robber, trying to bring something back to life. Meanwhile, the investigation tightened. Captain Delorme now had enough clues to build a psychological profile. He spent hours studying Lucien's past, his restoration reports, his lectures, even his old emails. He's not after money, Delorme told his team. He's after meaning. Elise listened quietly during the briefing, her expression unreadable. She had known Lucien once, admired his mind, envied his fearlessness. Now she wasn't sure whether to pity him or to understand him. "Meaning can be more dangerous than greed," she said finally. "Greed ends when it's satisfied. Meaning never does." Clara, on the other hand, found herself drawn deeper into Lucien's story. Through sources and archives, she pieced together his life, the idealistic student who once argued that museums should loan masterpieces to orphanages, hospitals, and schools, so that children could see beauty before they saw despair. The dreamer who believed that art belonged not to nations but to humankind. Her article draft grew longer and longer, its tone shifting from crime report to meditation. She didn't defend him, but she couldn't condemn him either. In her notes, she wrote, "Perhaps the greatest theft is not taking a painting, but keeping beauty locked away from those who need it most." In the shadows, Lucien read her article when it went live online. He had expected anger, mockery, judgment, but what he read instead was something softer, something dangerously close to empathy. It stirred something in him. "Someone understands," he whispered. For the first time, he considered the possibility of reaching out, not to justify himself, but to explain. He began drafting a letter not to the police, not to the museum, but to her, the journalist who had seen the thief as a human being, not a monster. "Miss Moreau," he wrote, "I took the painting not to hide it, but to set it free. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking for understanding. Come and see what I have seen, and then decide whether this is a crime or an act of devotion." He signed it only with an initial L, and sent it through an encrypted email. Then he waited. When Clara received the message, her heart pounded. Every instinct told her to inform the authorities, and yet, curiosity, that ancient siren, whispered louder. She reread the letter again and again, searching for hidden meaning. Finally, she replied with a single line, "Where?" Hours later, she received coordinates, an address on the outskirts of Paris, near an abandoned art restoration workshop. The next evening, under a pale crescent moon, she arrived. The air was cold, the streets silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Inside, the studio glowed faintly through the windows. She hesitated, then stepped inside. And there, illuminated by a single lamp, was Lucien Dufresne, older, thinner, but unmistakably intense. The painting stood behind him, glowing softly, almost holy. "You came," he said, his voice calm. "I needed someone to see her, really see her, before the world takes her back." For a long time, Clara said nothing. She walked closer, drawn by the magnetic stillness of the lady with the golden veil. The brushstrokes seemed alive, trembling with unseen energy. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "She's alive." Lucien smiled faintly. "That's all I wanted someone to feel again." Then he turned to her, eyes tired but fierce. "Do you think I'm a criminal?" he asked quietly. Clara met his gaze. "I think you're a man who loves beauty too much for his own peace." He laughed softly. That's fair, he said. Unbeknownst to them, Delorme's team had already traced the digital trail from Lucien's encrypted email. Even as they spoke, unmarked cars were surrounding the district. But inside that studio, time seemed to hold its breath. 2 people, a painting, and a shared question that echoed louder than the sirens that were yet to come. Outside, the night deepened, and in the distance, Paris glowed not with gold, but with the quiet light of souls still searching for what beauty truly means. The wind had turned restless that night. Paris was wrapped in a trembling stillness, the kind that often comes before storms, both of weather and of fate. Streetlights flickered against damp cobblestones, and from the Seine rose a mist so fine it blurred the edges of everything, as though the city itself didn't want to see what was about to unfold. In an old art restoration warehouse on Rue des Jardins, 2 souls stood in quiet confrontation before a painting that had outlived them all. Lucien Dufresne sat at his workbench, hands folded, eyes distant. Clara Moreau, notebook still in her bag, stood across from him, unable to decide if she was a journalist, a witness, or a conspirator. Between them, the lady with the golden veil rested on an easel like a silent judge. Her eyes, painted centuries ago, seemed to follow them both, calm, knowing, and sorrowful. You shouldn't have come, Lucien said softly, breaking the silence. They'll trace you here. Clara shook her head. You invited me, she replied. If you wanted to disappear, you wouldn't have reached out. He smiled faintly. Maybe I wanted to be found, but by the right person. Clara looked around the studio. It was both chaotic and reverent. Canvases leaned against the walls, half-restored portraits peered through dust, and jars of pigments glimmered like captured stars. Every object spoke of obsession, the kind that blurs the line between genius and ruin. You could have been one of the greatest conservators of your generation, she said quietly. Why throw it all away? Lucien exhaled, a slow, trembling breath. Because greatness means nothing if it comes at the price of truth. They call it preservation, but it's embalming. The Louvre doesn't protect art, it traps it. I wanted to remind people that beauty isn't meant to be owned, it's meant to breathe. He paused, looking at the painting as if seeking its approval. You see her, don't you? The sadness in her eyes. She's not at peace behind bulletproof glass. Clara took a cautious step closer. You talk about her as if she's alive. She is, Lucien replied simply. Not in flesh, but in memory, in feeling. Art is a mirror for the soul, and we've forgotten how to look. Outside, Captain Delorme's convoy approached, engines muted, tires whispering over the wet pavement. He had been tracking the signal for hours, guided by a mixture of intuition and quiet regret. As the building came into view, he signaled his team to cut the lights. No noise, he ordered. He's not armed, but he's dangerous in his own way. Elise, who had insisted on coming despite protocol, stood beside him, her expression tight with sorrow. I need to be there, she'd said earlier. He won't listen to anyone else. Delorme had agreed, though he knew this night would haunt her. Inside the studio, Lucien felt the shift, that faint, electric awareness when fate begins to close its circle. He rose and turned toward Clara. They're here, he said, not in fear but in acceptance. She blinked. How do you? He gestured toward the window, where the glint of a flashlight briefly cut through the mist. I knew this would end one of 2 ways, either the world listens, or it silences me. Then let me tell your story, Clara said urgently. If you surrender, if you explain. He smiled, a tired, tender smile. Stories don't change the world anymore, Clara. Pictures do. He picked up a small, worn notebook from the table and handed it to her. Take this. It's my manifesto, everything I believe about art, truth, and freedom. If I vanish, make sure people read it. Before she could respond, a voice echoed from outside, Lucien Dufresne. This is Captain Arnaud Delorme of the National Police. We know you're inside. Step out slowly. Clara's heart raced. Lucien looked at the painting one last time. She's waited centuries for someone to understand her, he whispered. Tonight, she'll be seen. He turned to Clara. Promise me something. Don't let them turn this into just another headline. I promise, she said, though her voice trembled. The doors burst open, and armed officers flooded the space, flashlights slicing through the dim light. "Hands where we can see them," Delorme shouted. Lucien raised his hands calmly, his expression serene. Elise stepped forward, eyes glistening. "Lucien, please," she said softly. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." He turned toward her, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Ah, Elise, you always believed in perfection. But art isn't perfect, it's alive. That's what makes it divine." Delorme gestured to his men. "Take the painting carefully," he ordered. But Lucien stepped between them and the lady with the golden veil. "You don't understand," he cried suddenly, his calm fracturing. "If you take her back, she'll fade again. She belongs to no one." "Lucien," Delorme said quietly, lowering his weapon, "it's over. You've made your point. Don't destroy everything you've built." For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Lucien stepped aside. "Fine," he said, his voice barely audible. "But promise me she'll be cared for. Not hidden, not hoarded." Delorme nodded. "I'll see to it." Two officers carefully lifted the painting from the easel. The air seemed to thicken, as though even the dust refused to let go. When they carried it past Lucien, he closed his eyes. A single tear traced down his cheek, glinting in the lamplight. Clara stood frozen, torn between sympathy and heartbreak. She wanted to speak, to reach out, to say something that could bridge the impossible distance between right and wrong, but words failed. As the officers escorted Lucien out, Elise followed in silence. At the doorway, Lucien turned to her. "Do you remember what I told you once?" he asked softly. "That every masterpiece carries the fingerprint of its maker's soul?" Elise nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes. Then remember this," he said. "So does every crime done in love." He was led away into the mist, his figure dissolving into shadow and siren light. The night swallowed him, and with him, the last trace of rebellion. Back inside, Clara stood alone before the empty easel. The studio felt hollow, as if some sacred ritual had ended. She opened the notebook Lucien had given her. The first line read, "To steal a painting is madness unless the world has forgotten how to see." She closed it gently, realizing that this was not just a confession, but a mirror held up to the times, a message to a world too busy to notice beauty unless it's taken away. Outside, as dawn began to soften the edges of the sky, Delorme watched the prisoner being placed into the van. Elise stood beside him, arms crossed, silent. "You did what you had to," she said finally. Delorme nodded, though he looked anything but victorious. "Justice," he murmured, "has a strange way of breaking the right people." Clara stepped out a few minutes later, notebook clutched to her chest. Delorme turned to her. "You'll write about this?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. But not the way they expect." He gave a small, knowing smile. "Then maybe some good will come of it." The police cars pulled away one by one, their lights fading into the dawn. The street fell silent again. And in that silence, Paris began to breathe as if the city itself had witnessed something sacred and sorrowful. The painting was safe, the thief was caught, and yet, somehow, no one felt victorious. For in trying to save beauty, a man had lost his freedom. And in punishing him, the world had learned how fragile beauty truly is. Morning came softly over Paris, like a slow exhale after a sleepless night. The rain that had lingered through the darkness had stopped, leaving the streets polished in silver light. The Louvre stood quiet, its courtyard glistening, as if freshly awakened from a fevered dream. Inside, the museum staff moved with cautious reverence, reinstalling the lady with the golden veil back into her rightful place, restoring order to what chaos had touched. Yet even as the painting returned to its frame, something invisible had changed. The air felt charged, aware. As if the walls themselves understood that this was not the same artwork that had once hung here. She had left, and she had returned, and in doing so, she had lived. Clara Moreau stood at a distance, watching through the glass as the conservators handled the painting. Her press badge hung loosely around her neck, her notebook heavy with words she hadn't yet written. The events of the previous night replayed endlessly in her mind, the cold air, the flashing lights, Lucien's calm surrender, his words like broken poetry. Every crime done in love. She could still hear the weight of that sentence in the silence that followed. It wasn't just the act that haunted her, it was what it revealed, the fragile boundary between reverence and rebellion. Between loving something enough to protect it, and loving it too much to let it go. When the museum director gave his statement to the press that morning, the cameras captured the usual mixture of triumph and solemnity. "The painting is safe," he said. "Our security protocols are being re-evaluated. We are grateful to the police for their swift and professional recovery." But even as he spoke, the journalists weren't just writing, they were feeling. Behind every question about logistics or arrests was a deeper unease. Why had this theft struck such a nerve? Why had it captured the world's imagination more than any other heist in years? Clara knew why. It wasn't about the painting, it was about what it represented. A man had risked everything not to profit, but to provoke thought, and that was something far rarer, far more dangerous. That afternoon, she sat by the Seine, her laptop open, the wind lifting her hair as she began to write. She didn't start with dates or names or facts. She started with silence, the kind that fills a gallery when you stand before something truly beautiful. Then she wrote. "Some people steal for money. Others for glory. But once in a lifetime, someone steals to remind us what cannot be owned." Her article, titled Echoes of the Frame, was published 2 days later. It spread like wildfire, translated, quoted, debated across continents. Some called Lucien Dufresne a madman, others a visionary. But what Clara had managed to capture wasn't his crime, it was his humanity. She wrote about his philosophy, his notebook, his belief that art had become imprisoned by value. She wrote about the painting itself, how its subject's gaze seemed to change depending on who looked at her, as if she reflected the soul of the observer. And she ended with a single question. If beauty belongs to everyone, why do we lock it away? That question rippled across the world. Universities debated it. Artists painted tributes to the lady with the golden veil. Protesters in Rome, New York, and Tokyo carried placards that read "Art is not property." Even the Louvre, under pressure from public sentiment, announced a new initiative to bring lesser-known masterpieces into public spaces, hospitals, schools, libraries, just as Lucien once dreamed. Irony had turned to legacy. Meanwhile, Lucien sat in a quiet cell at La Santé prison, awaiting trial. His days were simple: morning light, a rationed meal, the scratch of pencil against paper. They allowed him to paint again, under supervision. His cell walls became a patchwork of sketches, fragments of the painting he had loved, reinterpretations of her face in hundreds of moods: serene, sorrowful, defiant, forgiving. The guards often paused at his door, drawn by the strange peace that filled the room. "He's different," one of them said. "Most men count days. He paints them." Elise visited him once. It was raining again, the sound of water drumming softly on the iron bars. She stood outside his cell, unsure what to say. "You could have asked for change," she said finally. "You didn't have to burn your life for it." Lucien smiled faintly, looking down at his hands. "Sometimes," he replied, "fire is the only language that gets noticed." She sighed. "You've made the world question everything. But was it worth losing your freedom?" He looked at her then, eyes steady. "Freedom isn't what they took from me. It's what I gave to her." He nodded toward an unfinished sketch of the lady with the golden veil. "And maybe, to you too." Elise felt her throat tighten. "You're impossible," she whispered. "Maybe," he said gently. "But so is art." Meanwhile, Clara's article had made her a reluctant celebrity. Talk shows invited her to speak about ethics, art, and morality. Publishers wanted a book. Her inbox overflowed with messages, some praising her compassion, others accusing her of glorifying a criminal. But she ignored the noise. Instead, she kept revisiting the Louvre, standing before the painting that had changed everything. She noticed how crowds now gathered around it, not for selfies or spectacle, but in silence. People looked again. Children whispered to their parents about the woman in the veil. Couples stood hand in hand. The frame had become more than an exhibit, it had become a story. And that, Clara realized, was Lucien's victory. He had forced the world to see again. Weeks later, One of her visits coincided with a new placard beside the painting. It read, "Stolen in 2025. Recovered the same year." Its journey is a reminder that art lives not in possession, but in perception. Below it was a small quote, unsigned, but unmistakable. "To see is to love. To love is to set free." Clara smiled faintly. Somewhere, someone had listened. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, she walked along the Seine once more. The city felt lighter, more awake. Street artists painted on bridges, musicians played violins by the water, strangers paused to admire, to share, to see. It was as if Paris had rediscovered its heart. She pulled out Lucien's notebook and turned to the last page, one she hadn't read before. It contained a single line, written in quick, confident strokes. "If I vanish, let the painting speak for me. She has always had more to say." Clara closed the notebook and whispered into the wind, "She did, Lucien. She did." Far away, in his cell, Lucien looked through the small barred window. The sky was turning gold. Somewhere beyond those walls, the world was looking differently at beauty, not as something to own, but to feel. And in that moment, even within confinement, he felt free. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame tolled again, carrying across the river, echoing through the streets. Each note sounded like a heartbeat, a quiet reminder that art, like love, like truth, could never truly be caged. And in the Louvre, under soft evening light, the lady with the golden veil shimmered faintly, her painted lips curved in what almost looked like a smile.